Welcome to our webinar with Chris Jones. Chris Jones is the longtime chief theater critic and Sunday culture columnist of the Chicago Tribune, where he has been on staff since 2002. Throughout the 1990s, he covered Broadway and its tours for Variety. He is the author of Bigger, Brighter, Louder, 150 Years of Chicago Theater, and his work has appeared often in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Jones read drama at the University of Hull in the UK and has a PhD from The Ohio State University. In 2011, Jones was named by American Theater Magazine as one of the most influential theater critics in America. In 2014, he became the director of the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center's National Critics Institute in Waterford, Connecticut. Jones is a winner of the George Jean Nathan Award for Dramatic Criticism, the most prestigious honor for drama critics in the United States. He's also the author of the 2019 book, Rise Up Broadway and American Society from Angels in America to Hamilton, published by Bloomsbury, and I'm sure available at fine bookstores everywhere. Rise Up is a fascinating deep dive into the past 30 years of Broadway theater, and it's a very accessible read, even to folks who think that they have only a casual interest in Broadway theater. In the book, you focus particularly on the way that new Broadway shows have taken what you call a turn towards the substantial, which I think is a great phrase, or a more meaningful connection to current events, a turn which accumulates in the 2015 smash hit Hamilton, a play that is, I think, as a lot of people talk about, is deeply connected to Obama's second administration. What I really enjoyed about your book is the way that it made me think about Broadway as a kind of Greek chorus to American life that helps Americans understand themselves. So I'd like to start our conversation here, if I can, and ask you to talk a little bit about the subject of your book. So how has Broadway influenced American culture over the last 2 decades or so? How does Broadway sort of reflect American culture back upon itself?
Well, I thank you so much. It's such a pleasure, Sarah. Thank you for having me. Go Bucks. And I'm thrilled to be, always thrilled to do anything with Ohio State. I consider no Ohio State, no Chris Jones life and career. So I just want to say thank you to the university, to the faculty that I enjoyed being taught by all those years ago, and it is deep in my heart. And so thank you so much. Well, I would say that, it is sort of fascinating how we've ended up, Broadway has sort of become, really did, I think, take a, as you say, Sarah, kind of a move towards the substantial. I think that most people in the arts are very much aware, I think, that the world is always out to trivialize us. There's always this idea that the theater is insubstantial. As people say the same thing about literature in general, of course, but that what we've begun to see, I think, over the last several years, especially with Hamilton, is that Broadway has found a way to get to really the center of the national discourse on politics. I mean, as I sit here, Hamilton aired over the July the 4th weekend, for example, on Disney Plus. And Disney Plus now has, I think, 75 million subscribers. And it seems that at least that many people watched it based on my mailbox. So in Hamilton, you have, I think, clearly the most successful piece of theater of my life, certainly my professional life, that there's never been a show quite like Hamilton when it comes to really getting to the center of the national zeitgeist. It somehow managed to do what no other show had ever really done before. And I think it did it sort of in a whole variety of different ways. One of the ways was it was able to, it wasn't frightened of being about America itself. So you actually had a show where the topic was America itself. So that was kind of the first thing that happened. And then I think the second thing about it was that it decided, for example, that it could take the founding fathers, and they didn't have to be those musty looking old white guys on your 20, your $10 bill in your wallet, but they actually could be played by a cast that really looked like America. And so those were the sort of the two central ideas. Here's a show about the Secretary of the Treasury, and here's a show where we're going to make non-traditional casting the very center of the show, the very heart of the idea. And then what happened is that the guy that wrote it, Lin-Manuel Miranda, had developed a close relationship with the Obama administration, as you alluded to, Sarah, and that he, over the course of that administration, he really wrote the musical mostly at the White House. And I think in many ways, Hamilton is a metaphor for the Obama administration. And in some ways, it's sort of interesting. One of the interesting anecdotes that I think are fascinating about Hamilton is that a lot of folks probably remember the moment that there was an election 4 years ago, you may recall, a presidential election, and President Trump won that election. And in the days, this moment 4 years ago, almost to the day actually, the vice president-elect Mike Pence went to the theater and he went to see Hamilton. Very, very polite, very respectful. And as he was leaving, the cast of Hamilton decided to address the vice president from the stage and basically said, we're a bunch of diverse Americans. We hope you'll respect our rights. It was quite a pleasant exchange. But then the president-elect, Mr. Trump, didn't care for that, and he tweeted about it. And I always sort of think what's fascinating to me is how, Mr. Trump made many, many tweets, as we all know. They were his defining sort of mode of communication of his presidency. His first controversial tweet was actually about Hamilton. And so I had a moment when I saw that tweet of like, wow, this is a piece of theater, a Broadway musical. People think of, a chorus line or chorus people. And look at this. Theater is at the center of the American discourse, all the political, the presidential transition, all the political debate in the country. And I remember thinking, I've never seen that before, I mean, I've seen popular shows before, and there's been shows about politics before, but never a show that went to the center of the American discourse like that. Now, the other thing, though, as we sit here, is that was 2016. Now it's 2020, and the world has spun forward again, as Tony Kushner would say. And now Hamilton maybe is not as current as it was. Now we're moving into a whole other area. But at that moment, Broadway, I guess my premise of my idea here is that Broadway had finally gotten to where every theater major at Ohio State wished it could go, but never believed it could. It did. And Hamilton was the show that did it.
I think that's really, I like the way that you start with Hamilton and then you rewind back to Tony Kushner and you rewind back to Angels in America, because even though Hamilton is like the peak, the most successful show, the show that connects right with the one outgoing president and an incoming president, that moment doesn't just happen in isolation. It happens because of this ecosystem that had been developing over time from Kushner's Angels in America forward. So I was wondering if you might sort of speak to that integration a little bit more that you draw from in the book, how like a Broadway smash hit doesn't just sort of come sui generis, it comes in response to or as a result of work that was done before.
Well, I think that's right. And so that my thinking is, so Broadway and American theater in general, but Broadway in particular, tends to build on what has gone before. So, and I always think sometimes that people who think they want to revolutionize Broadway and throw everything away often don't succeed. The people that succeed the most are the people that manage to take what you might say other people have done before, and then build on it and change it. And that, I think, is what Hamilton managed to do. So, for example, if there's any Hamilton fans listening to this webinar, you might know that there are references in that show, say, to other musicals like Les Miserables. There's a scene that kind of pokes fun at Les Miserables. There's a reference to Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. South Pacific gets a mention. It also mentions rappers, specific rappers. And so, in other words, a musical, for the most part, is a sort of a building on of what other people have achieved. So it's not, Broadway tends not to get reinvented every season. People tend to build on things. So I think that's really an important, really important point that you make. I guess my feeling was that this world of this march towards the substantial, let's say, really began for me in the AIDS era, when at that point you saw, in a moment not unlike this one in so many ways, you saw a time where the creative professions especially were really being decimated, and by a plague, a plague of sort of unknown origin, and that were having a horrific impact on the theater specifically and on dance. If we think back to that era, how we lost an entire generation of choreographers as a consequence of it. Speaking here of sort of the late 80s, early 90s, just as I was getting out of Ohio State graduate school, just getting my PhD. And at that point, that people were very much aware of that. And so in the environment that AIDS created in the arts, in Columbus too, I recall very vividly what it was like to be in Columbus in the late 80s when I was in grad school at Ohio State. And there were people in my department, there were people in the theater community in Columbus, all were dealing with AIDS in some way, shape, or form. And I think that moment, the pain of that moment, brought on a new interest in the theater in being more substantial. I truly do. And I guess I feel that really showed up most obviously in this play, Angels in America, which Tony Kushner wrote. Of course, Tony would go on to write the screenplay to the movie about Spielberg movie about Lincoln, and many other great plays. But in Angels, he brought some things to the American theater. And by the American theater, I mean the mainstream Broadway theater that had not really been there before. And I would say some of those things would include impatience, that the idea that there was a need, that this play was essential, that the stakes were high in a way that really Broadway up to that point hadn't really done in the same way. Impatience, political awareness. It was generally perceived before Angels that a play about politics was the play that closed next week. That there was no way to make money with a serious political play. And Angels in America, at least in the first part, proved that wrong. It was a big hit and it did make money. But up to that point, if you look at sort of the 80s on Broadway, you're like, well, what was the big hit? Well, Brighton Beach Memoirs by Neil Simon, perfectly great play. Loved Brighton Beach Memoirs, but not what I'm talking about here at all. Something completely different. A comedy, a family drama, very much in the great tradition of American drama. Angels was a blend of historical figures and fictional figures. It was really a play about the quest for spirituality, I think, and an attempt to sort of define what religion meant to people who may not like organized religion. The idea that you could be alienated from religion, and yet at the same time, that didn't mean that you didn't have a spiritual quest of your own. So if you look back on Angels, for example, what you sort of see in that play are characters that have been essentially, it's not that they've thrown away religion has thrown away them, and they are sort of left, it's sort of like in that era, some of us would go to lots of funerals. I remember many of those funerals, and often the person who died would be very young, and would have died very quickly. And at the back of the room, there'd be parents, maybe, if they were even there at all. But there was a good chance they were alienated from whoever had just died. And the services were often a mix of, let's say, secular things like the Beatles, and maybe sort of spiritual things as well. So there's certainly always been political riders around. But I think what happened, and again, as I'm saying all this, it sounds like I'm talking about now, but in the AIDS era, I think what happened is that political riders were forced to confront the need to ask questions about God in a way that they hadn't done before. And Angels, for me, is kind of the ultimate manifestation of that thing, if that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to just sort of put a pin in where I was going to take the conversation, because I Angels in America, of course, was also put to film, where it was successful, and I think that that partially accounts for its fame afterwards. Its subsequent availability and accessibility is that you can see this work. And I'm curious, as this is currently a move that some Broadway productions have taken, Hamilton, another one, um, which which Miranda had planned, and the producers of Hamilton had planned long before COVID put us all in lockdown. But I'm curious about the relationship between filmed productions and their lasting success. Because I think that there's a temptation to say, if you film a Broadway production, nobody's going to want to see it again. But I think the case of Angels in America certainly belies that. You can see Angels in America when theaters were open, you could see it fairly regularly on stages, since it's a big production and people find it really worthwhile to go and see. So,
well, I think it partly depends how good the film version is. So if we look at, to give two examples of shows we've been talking about, Angels in America, the HBO version of that, which Tony Kushner was very intimately involved with, is excellent. I mean, it is actually, I think for me, Angels is a fundamentally theatrical experience, but I'm biased. I'm a theater critic. So for me, the HBO version, the late Mike Nichols' version, is excellent, but it's not, and it's got Meryl Streep, so good Lord, but it's not the play for me. And in preparation for today, I was looking at some clips from the 1993 version of Angels, and it was, some of the acting in that was really remarkable. And I would always rather see that than watch the film version. But there's no question that if you're listening to this and you've never seen Angels in America, and you watch, during your lockdown, if you watch the HBO version, all those 6 hours of it, you get absolutely a close experience there to what it was in the original. Similarly, what happened with Hamilton was the Disney version that I'm guessing a lot of people have seen who are on this call. That Disney version is very good. It's the original cast, which of course you would not see if you went back to back to the theater now. It's the original cast. It was shot with multiple cameras, and it doesn't attempt to be a movie. So, what's happened in the world of Hamilton really is that they're sort of holding fire on the movie. So there may or may not be a movie as we sit here. I think there will be, but they haven't said that there'll definitely be one. This is a filmed version of the actual stage performance. The intention with the thing that everybody saw on Disney Plus had not been to release it yet, because what they had intended to do was run Hamilton, tour it to places like Columbus, Cleveland, for another 18 months, and then release this thing that they already had in the can. But the pandemic kind of forced their hand, really, and Hamilton had to close. And there is, as we sit here, a bit of a question about, can Hamilton come back? I don't think there's a question about whether Hamilton can come back, to the extent, if it doesn't, why are we all living our lives at this point, right? We have to hope this stuff is all coming back. But whether Hamilton will come back at the same economic level that it left with is a really, I don't know as I sit here. I mean, we can hope so, but obviously that's going to be very complicated. So they made the decision, which was kind of brilliant, to broadcast it on the 4th of July. And I remember thinking, God, they're so savvy, because at the time, President Trump, had been sort of arguing for 4th of July fireworks celebrations going ahead as planned, right? So I thought, okay, so this is the great conflict of the 4th of July now. It's, do you go out to a fireworks display, or do you stay home? And all the sort of people who are opposed to Trump are going to stay home and watch Hamilton. And I was like, so clever. Once again, they'd managed to insert themselves right at the center of like the American discourse. And I'm like, it's brilliant. They're just very, very savvy. And Lin-Manuel Miranda, a very, very clever guy.
And they live streamed it too, right? So there was
No, it was not live streamed. It had been taped. Yeah.
So sorry, what I meant is that there was a
Yeah.
live watch party.
Oh yeah. Oh yes, exactly. Yes, there was. Yeah.
With the original Hamilton cast and a hashtag, all sort of taking part in the conversation. So you could be at home and you could maybe have your tweet boosted by
exactly. Exactly. The most amazing, I saw Hamilton, I think nearly 20 times in all these different productions. That might be an exact, over a dozen for sure. I actually went to opening night in Puerto Rico. That was the most incredible of them all, because the experience of the audience there was just so incredibly intense that they for that show, arriving on the island meant so much to everybody. And I remember going to a press conference afterwards that Lin-Manuel Miranda was speaking at, and I remember everybody saying, Lin, what are you going to do about statehood? What are you going to do about crime? And I remember thinking, and Lin was sort of saying, I'm just a guy that wrote a musical. And I remember thinking, how can you possibly live up to the pressure, of that moment? But all that then changed really with the pandemic, and a lot of the sort of the hype of Hamilton sort of dissipated as we all disappeared into our basements, where you find me now.
Well, this leads usefully.
Not to be depressing, everybody.
But this issue of economics leads me to my next series of questions, because the thing I really enjoyed about your book was the way that it highlighted the way that Broadway shows function economically, which is something that if you work in theater, you implicitly understand because you have to make a living doing this. But I think is not as widely appreciated by others. But Broadway is a business venture that has a lot of money at stake in it. But it's not just an economy for the shows themselves or for the artists. There's also these sort of satellite economies that live around theaters, where theaters are sort of like on Broadway, theaters are the anchors. But you have all of this other economy in the neighborhoods that are around them. So that the hotels, the restaurants, and the bars that function because they support the act of folks going to the theater. So could you speak to the sort of broader impact of the arts on the economy as you see it?
All right. Well, since you asked me that, I'm just going to say right now, New York doesn't come back until Broadway comes back. Cities don't come back until Broadway comes back, and I really mean that. And I don't think it's an overstatement. I think if we look right now at the state of the American city, we don't see it in a good state. I live in Chicago, as most people probably on this call know. It is terrible here at the moment. It is terrible. I find it painful to drive around or walk around downtown. And what I find painful more than anything is the lack of people, and the closed restaurants, and the empty sidewalks, and the closed stores, and of course, the closed theaters. And I think in New York City, the symbol of Broadway being closed is so devastating on an ongoing basis as to really hamper that city's recovery. I'm sorry if that sounds like an overstatement, but I don't think it is, because I think it's a talisman that
once Broadway comes back in New York, there will be a feeling that things are going to be okay. And until it does, I really feel that people are um, so disoriented with this situation. And it's particularly true in cities, because if you really, so right now there's a lot of discussion going on about, are cities over? Like, in the sense that people are moving to the suburbs or they're moving to rural areas because in this pandemic, they want space, they want to be alone. We're seeing this huge sort of change in American society away from urban clustering out to, rural areas, all of which are well and good. And God knows I feel that myself. But some of that is coming out of the idea that, what is a city? If you're living in a small town and you're deciding to go to a big city, or maybe even deciding to go live there, you're probably going, well, I'm going there for culture. Most people, often people who retire to cities, say the same thing. They want museums, which are closed in Chicago today, as of today. They want theaters, which are closed at the moment, and they want restaurants, which, where I live, are also closed. At least for any kind of other than takeout. So it's left cities without really the appeal that the main appeal that they have, which is this kind of ability to attract people who want interplay with other humans and that kind of thing. So that, I think, I don't think you can overstate the impact of Broadway being closed. And the other thing I believe too, quite strongly, is that in a city like New York City, what makes people have to feel safe in a city, people want to feel safe. We all want to feel safe. And I think one of the things that ensures safety in a city is people. Like, in other words, you walk on a crowded sidewalk from, let's say you walk up 8th Avenue from 34th Street to 50th Street. You are surrounded by people. You feel you're almost on a carpet of people, and you feel safe. And I think once you take away those people, that's very difficult for people. And I think that that's a huge deterrent against crime. Lots of people is a better deterrent against crime than almost anything, better than any law enforcement. It's just people. And I think that until we have our theaters back, people won't feel that cities have come back, and that's why it's so imperative. The dilemma I've written, as you probably know, I've written a fair bit about this. And the dilemma, though, here's the dilemma really, is that there are lots of activities in the world that you and I can do that can be socially distanced or remote and can still be pleasant. So I'm hoping that everyone on this call right now is happy to hear from Sarah and Chris. And even though they're at home, they're sort of going, okay, well, I'm at home, but still they're fascinating people. And it's a nice event. We can have a nice event doing this. Can't do that in the theater very well. And a lot of that, as you pointed out, Sarah, is economic. So what that means really is that if you take the average Broadway theater, number one, it's a listed building. So anytime you say, okay, I want to blow up the building and build extra socially distanced lobbies, you can't really do it. Those theaters are historic, you can't do it. You have to get people in and out through crowded doors, very difficult. You have to, more importantly perhaps, you have to keep your actors and crew members safe. And to do that, that's very difficult in these cramped backstage areas where people are on top of each other, quite literally, in their dressing rooms. And then on top of all of that, you have an economic model that really is dependent on pretty full houses. So, one of the interesting things about Broadway economics is that most Broadway shows these days are full pretty much every night. What determines whether they're successful or not isn't so much how many people are there, but how much money they're paying. So at Hamilton, everybody's paying $600 for a good seat. At a tired, terrible show, they may be paying $50. But there are still people there in pretty much every seat. And that's how Broadway is run. So these producers, faced with this pandemic, have basically said we cannot operate at anything under full capacity. And some people have said, including me, what do you mean? Why can't Sarah and I go to the theater, and let's say that we're married, we can sit together, and then we can keep a row after that, a row between us and everyone else. And people have talked about it, and they've sort of run the numbers, and really the conclusion has been that it doesn't work. So essentially now what we're looking at is everything is to do with the vaccines. And the moment there is a vaccine, then I think at that point, theater will restart when enough people have the vaccine, that enough people feel safe. But they've not been able to work that out. Now, the issue though is, so let's say that, I'll speak for myself. I'm a vaccine optimist. I think we're all going to be okay. I think there'll be a vaccine fairly soon, hopefully, if the government can get it together. So, and I think I'll be back in a Broadway theater by next summer. I do believe that. I absolutely believe that. But there are a lot of unknowns about it, which are at what point will people feel safe? Because people have different tolerances for risks. And then the other thing that's happened, frankly, and this is a serious thing, is that this has been incredibly hard on people in artistic professions. If there are any actors listening here, you know exactly what I'm talking about. People have lost work. People who rely on the gig economy have, essentially lost job after job after job after job. And what we're seeing is kind of a talent drain. We're seeing people leave the arts. And the unfortunate thing is that in a lot of other countries, let's say in Europe particularly, the government has stepped in really with better help than has been forthcoming in this country. So really, there's been a little help with the PPP program and so on, but a lot of individual artists have really, or at least they feel that they've really been left on their own. And, I think the incoming Biden administration is going to have to address that. That there's going to have to be a cultural policy that's going to get the great American cultural machine back to work, especially live entertainment, which is, as we just were saying, is a crucial part of our cities. Our cities cannot survive without it. They're not attractive to people without it. Restaurants will close, apartments will go unrented. We have to sort this out as a country. There has to be a recovery strategy, which up to now, I don't think there's really been one.
Right, because it's not just actors. I think one of the things that people think about is they think, oh, Broadway shut. Well, the actors, they can figure out other stuff to do. They can do like voice training over Zoom or whatever. But there's designers and stagehands and people who have front of house experts and so on, people whose skills don't translate outside of the doing space. And that can be quite a challenge. These people need support, but they're part of this Broadway economy that is struggling right now. So is there any silver lining? Is there any upshots that you're seeing in some kinds of innovations? Right, Falstaff talks about necessity, making virtue of necessity. Is there any virtue of necessity coming out of this moment for some hidebound behaviors from Broadway that are sort of being pushed into, a greater awareness of technology's possibilities, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's really complicated. It's a really complicated question, I think, because I would say the central question in everybody's mind right now is this: are we going back to before, right? Are we going back? What nobody really knows right now in any field is to what extent are the changes that we're all living now permanent? And to what extent are they merely temporary? And you can find people on Twitter or anywhere else you look with either view. Some people say, oh, memories are short, another 6 months, everything will be back to normal. Everybody will be back in the office. You'll be teaching students. Zoom will be a dim and distant, terrible memory. We'll all go back to the way we were. There are other people who say, no, these are permanent changes, that you're not going to get on a plane now and fly to a conference with the same abandon that you did, you're going to go, I could do that virtually. And that anytime anybody makes that decision, it has economic consequences for anybody who makes their money, in a hotel, say, or working for an airline. And I think as we sit here, we just don't know. I suppose the intelligent person can sort of discern really that the likelihood is somewhere in the middle, that we will go back to many, many things, but that this moment will also bring us it will indeed bring us some changes. But there's not really any consensus on that. I mean, just to give you an example, there's a theory in architecture at the moment that what people want in a new building now, let's say a new cultural building, like the ones being built at Ohio State, not before time, I might add, that what people want in a new cultural building has changed. We want more space, or we want, for example, or we don't want to buy our ticket at a box office where there's no plexiglass. For a long time, we're going to want barriers. So there is that school of thought. And then there is the school of thought that says, that's all just going to go away and people are going to forget it in a few months. I've just been writing about a new theater in Chicago at Steppenwolf here in Chicago. It's $54 million theater. And I had a tour of it just a couple of weeks ago. And everything about that theater is designed to bring people together. So I'm walking around and they're going, this is a collision between students and actors. And I'm thinking, collision? I'm not looking for a collision right now. I'm looking, for as little collision as possible. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a big gamble, that we're all going to immediately go back to, I guess, a comfort with other people in our immediate proximity. And I just cannot get my head around, Sarah, at all, the likelihood of that. I think it's very, very, obviously it will get better than it is now, where I'm not leaving for the next week or two, but what will it go back to? And that is the question, I think, that really, that really is an issue for the performing arts. I mean, some things have happened in the last few weeks that I thought I would never see. If you had said to me, the Cirque du Soleil will go bankrupt, which they did, I'd be like, what? I used to think of them as the single most successful live entertainment entity like ever. 9 shows in Vegas, tours to Ohio, Montreal, the world. They were so successful. And then suddenly, like a lot of for-profit entertainment ventures, their income basically dried up. And they, as we sit here right now, they're struggling to survive. That is unbelievable that could have happened, really in the last few weeks. So, yeah, I just don't know. Now, let me just go back to your question about innovation. I've got a couple of things that I think are true. So the culture of theater, let's talk about theater for a second. The culture of theater, and this is true of music too, actually, and dance, God knows, it's true of dance especially, is that the people who work in it should feel privileged to be in it and should expect to have a certain level of hardship. So if, Sarah, you're a dancer and it's 5 o'clock and you say, I'm tired and I've got to go home and maybe I have other responsibilities at home, the choreographer can say, no, you're going to stay here and we're going to get this right. And a great dancer will always do that. So in other words, it's this idea that workplace rules don't really apply to the arts. And frankly, as educators, we tell our students that in the performing arts departments. We've traditionally told our students, you always be agreeable, always do what they ask. I think people have had it with that now. And I think that they're saying, look, enough with these endless rehearsals, these abusive directors. With this pandemic has cleared my mind. We are going to operate on a more professional level, let's say. And I think that is way overdue, and that will change a lot of the ways in which the arts operates. And that is a really, really good thing. I also think another really good thing is that people have had time to think about the existing who's included and who's excluded. And they've been able to think about those things and come up with a bit of a better plan to improve that in the future. And I also think that people have had time to come up with some cool creative ideas. And so I think we may see in 2021 or 22 a giant creative flowering in literature and in theater and dance, where all these people sitting in their lockdowns have written a new symphony or created a great play or written a beautiful novel. And that what's been missing is the chance to exhibit it. And suddenly we may be in for a kind of a Harlem Renaissance-like moment of this great flowering of all this creativity, which is not intended to make anybody feel bad if you've been sitting in your basement, drinking beer, because that's okay. But I'm just saying that not everybody has done that. So I do think hopefully we will see some of that.
Well, this is, as a Shakespeare scholar, this is one of the things that we often talk about, is how Shakespeare's creativity as a poet and as a playwright was blossomed under these moments of plague where his playhouses got shut down too. And he went, I better go write King Lear then. So I want to turn the conversation more specifically to theater in the Midwest and how it relates to how in order for theater to blossom here, we need the kind of spaces like the kind of spaces that OSU is currently building in the Arts District corridor on High Street. And for those in the audience who don't know, OSU is building a $160 million project to create world-class teaching facilities for music, theater, and moving image production, which we have a new major in moving image production in our film studies program. And by featuring these new performance spaces and recital halls and the fancy high-tech classrooms that film requires, the Arts District is going to provide us at OSU with new spaces for our creativity as working artists to thrive. And it's really easy for us to understand, I think, how OSU students and researchers will benefit from these spaces. But I was wondering if you could use your knowledge of sort of theater ecology more broadly to talk about how that benefits sort of Columbus or the Midwest more broadly.
So I landed at Ohio State at the age of just 21 in 1984. So I didn't know anything about anything. And I have lived pretty much my whole life in the Midwest, so most of it in Chicago since then. But I have lived, I'm a Midwesterner of 30 odd years standing now. And I'm a partisan for the Midwest. And I am always very determined that the coasts won't dictate the content for the Midwest. And of course, the coasts, as you know, like to do that. But in order for this great cities of the Midwest, like Columbus, which has come a long way in those years, and Cleveland certainly, and certainly Chicago, our best chance really to generate sort of cultural content, to be things other than consumers, is, I think, through the live performing arts. And there's a lot of evidence that shows you that that's possible. So certainly in Chicago, we see my city really revolutionizing late night comedy. One of my best parts of my job is covering Second City, an improv theater that gave the world Tina Fey and Stephen Colbert and Steve Carell and Seth Meyers. And really, without Second City, there wouldn't be what we now think of as late night American TV. So, and that came out of the Midwest. And I think that is sort of crucially important. And so I believe very strongly that the Midwestern cities, the governors of these states and the mayors of these cities have to promote what I would call cultural generation. They have to support creative people. And this can include chefs, for example. I think they're very much part of this ecosystem. Musicians, dancers, actors, filmmakers that are generating content, not merely as a location for a Hollywood studio, but actually generating content that is about these great Midwestern cities, to some degree replacing the industry that once dominated them. And I really feel that that's an existential threat. A city that doesn't do that, really struggles to have its point of view expressed on an international sort of stage. And I think that is crucially important. And then the other piece of that, Sarah, though, of course, is also the presenting piece, which really references what I mentioned before about urban renewal and the arts role in that. I mean, a fantastic example of that is in Cleveland, where you have Playhouse Square Center, that I've followed that particular place for 30 years, easy. And it has grown in that time. And other things in Cleveland have come and gone. The flats and all of that have sort of, they've been hot, then they've been less hot. But Playhouse Square really now is the anchor of that downtown. If you go to downtown Cleveland and you turn on Euclid, you find this vibrant place with restaurants, with big theaters that do music events as well as theater, that even have outdoor sculpture, that are pleasant places to hang out in normal times. And without Playhouse Square Center, downtown Cleveland would be unrecognizable to me. And that is an artistic thing. And if you look in Columbus at the short north, I'm always struck by, in my era in Columbus, the short north really was full of artists, studios. When I first started writing about culture in Columbus in the late 80s, that was what I was writing about. When I go back now, it seems a bit more trendy, lots of restaurants, kind of a different vibe. But, that often happens where artists gentrify things, and I think that anybody in Columbus would agree that that world in the short north and the university district creates jobs, promotes Ohio State as an institution, makes students want to go there, and has come really out of what was fundamentally an artistic impulse. If it had not been for the artist pioneers in the university district and in the short north, there would not be what is there now. And so you really have to understand, I think, the crucial role of the arts in this economic generation of these cities. And there are many Midwestern cities that have not made the same investments, that are, and you can tell. And you go to the downtowns and they're struggling more than cities that have said, okay, we can use the arts as a kind of an anchor to bring people here. And I think in Columbus the argument was always, well, we don't have a professional sports team, we have Ohio State, but we don't necessarily have an NFL team or a Major League Baseball team. And so I think that wasn't a bad thing, because I think it forced the city really to focus in more on culture, and it did it very, very well. And that's the success story. And Columbus is a success story now. I mean, I read about it all the time as being one of the most vibrant cities that's avoided a lot of the other problems of other cities, again, on the back of culture and cultural development.
Well, it's interesting because it sounds like one of the things that you're saying is that this new arts district is going to benefit not just the OSU community, but the Columbus community, the businesses on High Street. There's going to be this kind of ripple effect that's going to sort of spread out from this central corridor that is designed with students in mind. And I'm curious if you've seen any trends in the past decade or two about the relationship between university theater programs and young people's careers in the theater.
Well, I think what's happened is that universities, big universities at least, have become crucial arts presenters. And I think we've seen that in Columbus. It's certainly true at that school up north, where Ann Arbor has become a sort of the de facto cultural center of the state of Michigan, really, based on the efforts of the University of Michigan and something called the University Musical Society, which is a presenter in Ann Arbor that I know pretty well. And in other words, universities have become essential presenters of the arts. And I think that is not going to change. They obviously have the ability, especially in this recovery, they obviously have the ability to better support artists than, I mean, to be brutally frank right now, Sarah, a lot of what we think of as very prestigious arts organizations are really kind of floundering or worse. I mean, right now, for example, if you were to say to me, what's the most prestigious theater in the Midwest, I would probably have 6 or 7 answers to that. But on my list would be the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. And if anyone ever goes to Minneapolis, you know that the Guthrie is in this incredible building, cost, I think, $90 million or something. It's spectacular. It dominates the city. It's hugely important to the people of Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's a fantastic theater. And right now, it's not only closed, but it has laid off an enormous percentage of its staff. And there are real concerns, Sarah, I think right now, whether when we get out of this, whether the Guthrie Theater will come back at the, let's say, the level that it was when we left. And it's a little bit different if you look at the commercial theater. So Broadway closes, and I'm a producer, and I have a show, a musical. It's not too difficult for me to say, well, you know that musical I was going to do with all you folks? We'll just do that a year from now. And everyone goes, oh, that, they have to survive for a year, but they can basically do that. If you look at somewhere like the Guthrie, just turning on the lights or the running costs of the Guthrie are so enormous that as this pandemic has dragged on, and if you look at it now, most theaters lost everything from March. And the majority of them aren't really expecting to be back in business until the fall. Some people think there's a hope for the spring, maybe the summer, especially outdoors, if people can do that. But in terms of something approaching normalcy in the performing arts, we're really looking right now, probably at September, right? It's only November of the previous year. That's another year. And so their ability to survive in their current institutional structure is going to be challenged. And I think that universities like Ohio State are going to have to step into that breach to some degree. In other words, I think that the role of universities in the cultural lives of these Midwest cities is going to have to increase, because they have to step up really to serve their communities in this hour of need, basically.
I think that's a really great place to start to sort of think about OSU's responsibilities to the community, or put another way, OSU's potential to help its community at this watershed moment for culture in America. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to take a few questions of our Q&A.
Great.
And I'm curious what advice you have for aspiring arts journalists. You've had a successful career. What would you say to people who want a career like yours?
Well, I think, the old adage is you just got to write. I started out writing in Columbus for what was then an alt weekly called Downtown Alive that became Columbus Alive eventually. But I just found these folks who would pay me to write about all kinds of cultural things, movies and theater and restaurants. And I had the best time of my life doing it. And I think it's easier than ever now to find an outlet. I think there is an enormous, we all know that journalism is very challenged and that arts journalism is very challenged. I would say I spend about maybe half my working day writing or working on stuff. I spend the other half arguing with people about the importance of arts journalism, because there's always people who don't get it. And obviously, it doesn't always have the immediate traffic returns that other stories do. But you have to sort of make the case that, look, this is the fabric of the city. It's a responsibility. Like I was saying about the university, it's also the responsibility of a newspaper to support culture and the arts. So I'm a big like pain in the ass advocate for that stuff, and I think that that's super important. So, but I do think that great arts journalists are not easy to find, and it takes skill to write in a really interesting, stimulating way, whether it's criticism or whether it's reporting about artists. And the people that can do it well, there is absolutely work out there. You know, I spend a lot of time training young critics. I've gotten to work with some writers who are a lot better than me and certainly have much brighter, you know, I'm on the way out, they're on the way in, and I'm cool with that. They're great. Um, but but I do think that, you know, you have to learn how to write, and then you have to have a real love for what you're writing about.
I like to think of arts journalists as the kind of gardeners in the sort of cultural garden, right? Who tend and elevate and help support, you know, put in the trellis and help to make sure that the right plants get water. Um,
I think it's, you know, it's been one of the big disasters for Midwestern cities, actually, since we're talking about that, has been the decline of local newspapers. Like, if you go back to when I was in Columbus in grad school and I would get the Columbus Dispatch, at that point, the Columbus Dispatch had, somebody on this call may know the answer to this better than me, but I think there were 6 or 7 full-time arts critics at that newspaper. And down in Cincinnati at the Inquirer, you know, there was a classical music critic, there was a pop music critic, there was a restaurant critic. And so neither of those things are true. It's not that criticism or arts journalism has totally vanished, but people like me are definitely, you know, becoming sort of, people are out to get us. And I mean that in the sense that, you know, we're sort of, those newspapers are not valuing arts journalism in the way they once did. And that makes it very difficult. Like if you're if you're in Columbus and you're starting a new dance company, you have to have somebody who's going to come and is going to tell the people what you're doing. And if you don't have that, it makes the city just so much the poorer, because people don't just find stuff on their own. You know, you have to have somebody that people trust to say, look, check this out. And that's a crucial part of the ecosystem as well, I think. It doesn't have to be the same format. It doesn't have to be in print. It doesn't have to be me or anyone who looks like me, preferably not maybe, but there has to be somebody who's really focused on connecting the artist and the audience.
I think a plea for local journalism is a really great place for us to end on, because we are out of time. But I want to thank you so much for this
Pleasure.
conversation and for your book. I've learned a lot. It's been lovely chatting with you, and thank you all.
All right, thank you so much. Go Bucks, and thanks. And please know how much Ohio State is always in my heart. Thank you so much.